Hi, I'm Joanne DeMarco, and today we're going to make some braciola. It's a Sunday, and it's a day I got a lot of things I've got to get done. So if I make my braciola in the morning, by dinner time it tastes delicious. So I'm going to start right off the bat, cast iron skillet, and I'm going to get this to a medium flame. Now, I love to grow fresh herbs on my patio in the summer, and so sometimes it grows so fast I can't keep up with using them all. So I take basil, for instance, and I put it into little containers with a little bit of olive oil, and then I put 2 in a Ziploc, and then when I'm going to make my sauce, I can start with some fresh basil in this olive oil. And once the oil starts to melt, then I'm going to go ahead and put in some dried oregano. So fresh basil in oil, and then oregano, and I dry this also from my patio garden in the summer. While that's starting to melt, I'm going to chop up 4 cloves of garlic. And I'm going to chop this fairly small. I'm not going to say it's a total mince because that's really tiny, but I'm not going to I don't want anybody to bite into big chunks of garlic in my sauce. So it's kind of more of a rough chop. And you can see the consistency on this knife here. So chopping up 4 cloves of garlic. And listen, you can use garlic that's already been peeled. I personally like to get the cloves of garlic and then chop it myself. It's just, for me, I like the fresh garlic for this purpose, for the purpose of sauce. Now, there's some things that I'll use jarred garlic for. In fact, the inside of my braciola that you'll see later is I use an oven roasted garlic. But right now, what I'm doing is I'm creating the elements for my tomato sauce that the braciola is going to cook in. So again, getting my garlic chopped, as you can see the oil is starting to nicely melt with my basil in it. Might be a little high, so I'm going to turn it down a little bit. Again, you want a medium heat because what we're going to do is we're going to get the spices going in this pan, and then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the garlic and the onion in here. Now, I am going to cook my braciola and my sauce today in the crock pot. So in order to do that, I still want to make sure that I cook my onions and garlic good, and also make sure that I am letting my spices bloom. And if you watch any of my other videos, I talk about letting the spices bloom. What that means is you're cooking them in advance. You're giving them an opportunity to open up. And that's what heat will do for spices. So now I've gone ahead and I've got my garlic chopped. I'm going to add some oregano into this. And again, that's just dried oregano that I have from my garden. And I'm going to give a good amount in there. And again, I'm going to take this down just a little bit because I don't want this to go crazy. Now, I'm going to chop half of an onion. And when I do that, what I'm going to do is to make it easier on myself, I'm going to make cuts in to my onion like this. As I run on the side, they're about 1/2 inch apart. And I'm going to go not quite all the way through because I don't want to go all the way back here. Otherwise, this falls apart. But if I cut into it like this, then when I go to cut my onion, it's already cut into little pieces because it's already got those little fingers cut. And so it's a quick way to really dice up an onion. All right. I'm going to take my onion and my garlic, and I'm going to put it in with my spices. And I'm going to let them cook. Now, the garlic and the onion, you just want to cook it till it becomes translucent in color. So it actually takes the color away. When they're completely see-through, that's when you know that they're done. We don't want to burn them. We don't want to make them crispy. All we want to do is get them translucent so that when we go to put them in our sauce base, it's ready to go. Now, while this is cooking, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start to prepare my meat. Now, I let this get to room temp on the counter. It takes about half an hour. Once I get it to room temp on the counter, I'm using pork today to make my braciola. And in order to get the braciola so it rolls nice and easy, we need to pound the braciola. So what I'm going to do, I take an extra heavy, like a freezer strength Ziploc bag, and I put my pork chop right in here. Now, to keep the cutting board from moving all over the counter while I'm doing this, I'm going to put a dish towel under my cutting board. And this will keep the cutting board from flapping all over the place and making ridiculously loud noises. And still keeping an eye here to make sure that my onions and garlic are getting nice and translucent and my spices are toasty. See how that was just enough olive oil that I saved my basil in to make this cook? Now, I take my meat mallet and I take it on the flat side. And I just give a little pound to this pork, and I'm going to make it nice and thin so I can roll the meat. And this is about the thickness that we're looking for. Not so thin that it falls apart, but thin enough that it will roll nicely. All right. Still looking and making sure this mixture, still working on it. A few more minutes and it should be ready to take off the heat. Again, you can see how it's getting translucent in there. Some of the pieces are, some of them are still needing a little bit more of a cook. Now I've got 4 cutlets in here, and what these will do is you can either do 4 people and do a braciola each and some pasta, or 2 braciolas each, depending on how you like to do it. I am not sure. My daughter and her boyfriend may be coming over today. So if that's the case, everybody will get 1 braciola and they'll have some pasta with the sauce. And if not, if it's just my boyfriend and I for dinner, we'll probably each get 2. Now there is one little bonus cutlet in here. Sometimes it packs 4, sometimes it's 5. So I'm going to make 5 of them. This will probably be lunch tomorrow either way. Or if somebody's extra hungry and wants a second one tonight. All right, so my braciola is done. And at the same time, it looks like this is done too. Now, you can see the consistency here. It's translucent. The spices have nicely bloomed. So I'm going to shut this off and pause for a moment while I switch over to the next section we're going to be working on. Hi, I'm back, and we're going to go ahead and assemble the sauce in the crock pot. Now, the first thing I do is I get one of those disposable crock pot liners, because on Sunday night, the last thing I want to do is have a lot of cleanup from dinner. That's the whole purpose. I don't want to have a lot to do to make it tonight, and I don't want to have to clean up after it. So, crock pot liner in, and I just put it a little bit inside of here to hold it in place. Now, I am starting with 2 cans of crushed tomatoes. And again, I like to use the fire roasted crushed tomatoes. I think it gives it a really nice flavor. And in goes the first can. Now listen, in the summertime, I'm with you. I want to make my own sauce, but this time of year, I've kind of run out of anything I saved. 2 cans. Now, the fire roast just gives it a little extra depth of flavor that I like to have in my sauce. Sometimes if I'm using fresh tomatoes, I'll actually roast them on the burners of the stove. Now, I also add in 1 can of tomato paste, And I like to have a good Italian tomato paste. These flavors are super concentrated, worth splurging a little bit of extra money to get a really good quality tomato paste. Now, I also will take the equivalent of 1 can of water and put that in my sauce as well. And I'll be right back. All right, in goes my can of water into my sauce. And the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab that pan that we made with the spices and the garlic and the onions, and I'm gonna add that next. Okay, in goes all my deliciousness. You see how beautiful that looks? Translucent onions, garlic, toasted up spices. Now, I'm not done with this pan yet. I'm gonna hang on to it a little bit. And I'm gonna give this a good stir. I'm gonna make sure I'm mixing in the paste and breaking that up and getting a little bit of the water mixed in with all of the tomatoes. It just makes a nicer consistency to go on the pasta. If you like your sauce a little thicker, then go ahead and maybe put half a can of water in. But I like mine a little thinner. So you can see the consistency, and it'll thicken up a little bit when it cooks too. All right, the next thing I put in is a little bit of coarse black pepper, just a pinch. That maybe is a little generous pinch. And then in goes some kosher salt. Now, the tomatoes are very acidic. And then being in a can makes them a little bit tinny tasting for my liking. So I'm gonna share with you my top super secret tip for how to get that tinniness out of the tomatoes. Everybody always says to me, what's in your sauce? There's something different in here. And I just kind of smile at it. But now the world is gonna know, because I'm doing this video. I use a really good quality dark chocolate. In this case, it's the Jardelli 60% bittersweet. And I am going to break it up in small pieces, and that is going in my tomato sauce. You might think I'm crazy. You'll never taste it as chocolate in the sauce, but the chocolate will give it a different depth of flavor. Again, I like to add in layers of flavor, but it will also help get rid of the tinniness. Now, I'm gonna start this cooking. My lid's gonna go on, and I'm gonna put a timer on this. I'm gonna put it on low heat, and I'm gonna put a timer for 7.5 hours. Now, I have one of those crock pots that will, when it shuts off, when the timer shuts off, it'll keep it warm. So right now it's about 11:30. So we'll be eating probably around 7 o'clock tonight. And that'll work out perfectly for what I've got in the crock pot. All right, the next thing we're gonna do, I'm gonna shut down for just a minute while I get ready to make the braciola. All right, now it's time to make what goes inside of our braciola. I start with a medium-sized bowl. Take my rings off because I actually like to mix with my hands. I just washed them, so they're nice and clean. And I start with, I use whole wheat breadcrumbs. You can use whatever kind of breadcrumbs you like. I get the whole wheat seasoned breadcrumbs. Then I add my own seasoning on top of it, of course. So again, I'm stuffing 5 braciola. So I'm using about 1/3 of a can. That's about that much breadcrumbs. I wish I had an exact measure for you. I would guess that's about 1.5 cups. And then the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna crack in here. I'm gonna start with 2 eggs. Now I always crack my eggs into a separate dish because in case there's any shells in it or anything funky goes on with my eggs, I like to see that first. And my egg looks good, so I'll put it in. I know it seems like an extra step, but so worth it, so I don't have to go digging in here to get shells out. All right, I'm gonna start with 2 eggs and see where I'm gonna go from there. Now, the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add in my Parmesan cheese. Now, I add just about as much Parmesan cheese as I did breadcrumbs. So like 2 good sized handfuls of Parmesan cheese will go into here. And then some of that oregano that I had dried from my garden will go in here. And again, it's dried. If you were gonna use fresh oregano, you'd use almost twice as much as I would use for the dried. And then also, instead of just only doing my basil one way, I also dry my basil as well. Maybe once the herbs start coming in, I can even do a video on how to dry your herbs. Again, in goes some dried basil. Oh God, it smells so good. It reminds me of summer. Oh, it smells delicious. And then remember earlier I talked about not using fresh garlic in the inside of my braciola. I am going to use actually some of this jarred roasted garlic. Now, the reason I'm going to do that is raw garlic tastes terrible. You have to really cook garlic, whether you're going to saute it, whether you're going to oven roast it, whether you're going to fry it, doesn't matter, but you have to cook garlic. There's nothing worse than biting into like raw garlic. So because this is the only heat this is going to get is going to be layered in with things, it's not going to really, it's going to cook, but it's not going to cook the way you'd think. So I use the oven roasted dried garlic. Oven roasted jarred garlic, not dried. And I'm going to give a good generous portion in here because I like to taste my garlic. All right. Now I'm going in. I'm going to mix this with one hand because I want to keep the other hand free and not messy in case I have to add something. And I can tell already I'm gonna have to add another egg. Now, the reason the eggs are not an exact science is because eggs are different sizes. And I use like farm eggs, so they're like fresh. And so my eggs aren't all the same size on any given day. So that's why it's important to start with less, because you can't take an egg out, but you can always add an egg in. So now I'm starting to get to this consistency, and you can see it, where it holds its shape together. Now I'm going where I need to go with this, because this has got to hold its shape without being too runny. Now, next thing I'm going to add is some kosher salt. It's a little trick. You season the salt above, and then a little bit of coarse black pepper, same thing. This way you can see where the seasoning's going. All right, and then I get back in there, and my braciola is complete. Now, next step is I'm going to take those cutlets that we pounded out nice and thin, and I'm going to put them out on my cutting board. Now, the reason I do this is because I don't really want to have any of this filling left over, but I don't want anyone to get shortchanged. So if I do it this way, I can kind of put an amount on each one, and then I can spread the wealth if there's extra. So again, I got 5 of them, so I'm just kind of eyeballing this. Most of my cooking is not an exact science, I'm afraid. That's why I'm a terrible baker, because baking is an exact science. Now, the reason the filling varies from time to time is because the size of the pork chop varies. So sometimes you might get pork loin chops that spread out differently than this. Maybe they're larger. And see, if I do it this way and get them all going at the same time, I can add to it when I need to. Because you want to get, I don't want to say crust to crust, but you want to get a good amount in there, because this is where a lot of the flavor comes into play in Braciola. This is what makes Braciola different from pretty much anything else that you have out there, because there's no meat in this. So it's not like a meatloaf or a hamburger or a Salisbury steak. It is strictly eggs, breadcrumb, and cheese. And so that filling then takes on all these other flavors and then imparts its own flavors out there. So you can say I've done just about the exact amount. Somehow it always works that way. And flatten it all out. Now, this is how I roll my Braciola. I start and I roll just like this. And I'm kind of using my thumbs a little bit to kind of tuck some of that, the seasonings or the stuffing in there. And then one at a time, I'm rolling. So you've got meat and stuffing all kind of rolled into one. And then later when we eat this, it is amazing. So I'm gonna get them all rolled up. Now, there's some controversy on what to do next with this. Some people like to then sear this in the cast iron skillet before they put it in the sauce. Or they like to roast it in the oven before they put it in the sauce. I do not, because I like my meat to just fall apart. When these come out of this crock pot, you literally can pull it off with a fork. The meat is so tender. So I cook the whole thing right in the sauce. Now, what I did before I started this process is I cut this twine, it's just butcher's twine, and I cut them into pieces, about, 7, 8 inches. And then I'm going to tie these Braciola in 2 places. Now, I'm not going to tie it really tight, but I am going to give it a little bit of a snug, because this twine will hold this together. Now, this is where the people that like to sear it or put it in the oven, this is where we all differ, because if you sear this, a lot of times it'll sear it shut. Now, there's advantages. Another advantage to searing it in the skillet, and that is it caramelizes the meat, and caramelization adds flavor. So I have done it both ways, and I like it this way, like I said, because I think once I caramelize the meat, it's hard for the sauce and the flavors in the sauce to really penetrate this the way I want it to. So that's why I leave it like this. Now, my sauce has been heating almost a half an hour in this crock pot while I got all this stuff together and prepped these. So the sauce is all coming up to temperature nicely, so that when we're done tying these Braciolas, they're gonna go right in the sauce. And once I get these in the sauce, I don't have to do another thing all day. When it's dinner time, I lift this lid and we go. Now, as I said, if my daughter and her boyfriend come over later, I might have to boil some water for some pasta. But that's the only other thing I'm gonna do. And that's only if they come over. If they don't come over, my boyfriend and I will have just Braciola for dinner, and we will be happy little campers. And again, the cleanup is next to nothing. We'll have to put the leftovers, and I'll have, interestingly enough, I will have enough pasta or enough sauce in here that we can have Braciola for 2 nights by itself, and then enough sauce to have pasta on another night, because that's how much sauce will be in here. Now, if you're like me, I like to sometimes make my own pizzas at home. And so I'll freeze that sauce in little containers so that I can defrost it and put it on my pizza. There is nothing better than the meat sauce from this, because a little bit, the flavorings from the meat will come through into that sauce, and it's so good on pizza. It's so good on pasta. You can even make chicken parm with it. And sometimes I'll do that. And when I do, you don't have the chunks of the meat in there, but you have the meat flavor. So I'm gonna go ahead and put these all into my crock pot. And I kind of spread them around, one going on each side and one right down the middle. Once it's in, I go ahead and push them so they're fully submerged into this sauce. Lid goes on, and I push this back, and it is done until it's dinner time. And that's my Braciola. Now, I will come back later and show you what it looks like once it's cut open. And I also, when I serve it, generous handful of this Parmesan cheese on the top as well. We'll see that in a little while. Bye now.